December 16th, 2025, the Twitter account Discussing Film reposted a single photo from an Entertainment Weekly article with first look images from Christopher Nolan's upcoming film, The Odyssey. The photo features Anne Hathaway as Odysseus' wife Penelope and Tom Holland as their son Telemachus. A few days later, on December 18th, Discussing Film posted this film poster and announced an official release date of July 17th, 2026. And with that, the floodgates opened. Discourse and hot takes about this spine helmet design proliferated on Twitter, intensifying after a cam rip showing the front of the helmet was posted on December 19th. The original cam rip video has since been removed for copyright infringement, but a screenshot of the helmet has stayed up and triggered both positive and negative fan responses. When Discussing Film finally posted the official digital movie trailer on December 22nd, a heated discourse about the film had already been established on Twitter, with critics denouncing the film's art direction and Nolan bros firmly defending the director's creative choices. And underlying this whole Twitter shitstorm was the question of historical accuracy. What is accurate and what is not? Does historical accuracy matter? Is it necessary or is it lame? And as someone who researches how Greek mythology and ancient Greek culture is perceived and reimagined in contemporary media, I thought this would be a great opportunity to introduce folks to the field of classical reception studies. So, hi everyone, I'm Sierra, this is SquirrelCoded, and in this video essay, I'm going to investigate the topic of historical accuracy by using the Nolan Odyssey Twitter shitstorm as a case study. I'll give an overview of exactly what was being said by folks on Twitter and what all of this tells us about the implicit political stakes of movies like The Odyssey. I will also be posting a part 2 video that will address the racist backlash against Lupita Nyong'o and her casting as Helen of Troy, because that backlash was very much connected to this discourse of historical accuracy. I originally intended for this to just be one big video, but it was getting so long. So thus we have a part 1, part 2. The topics are connected. The videos are meant to be watched in conjunction, but if I do my job right, they should be able to stand on their own. Also, I'm going to include screenshots of many tweets in this video as evidence for the discourse that I'm discussing. I want to clarify that my inclusion of these tweets does not mean I condone these tweets, okay? Even if I may agree with the sentiment expressed in a tweet, I'm not aligning myself in any way with these individuals, okay? I did not look into their accounts or what kind of content they usually post. I am merely engaging with the individual tweets as they appeared on my feed, and I'm using them as evidence for the larger discourse. So it took me a long time to make this video essay, so by the time I post this, the movie will probably be out, but I have not seen it. There'll be no spoilers, I guess, but frankly, this video essay is not about the Odyssey movie itself, okay? This video essay is about how people discussed the movie in the lead up to its release and how they reacted to its various trailers and promotional materials, because the reception to this work of classical reception can also tell us a lot about contemporary people and how we engage with the ancient world. Alrighty, part 1. What is classical reception studies? Okay, first off, classical studies, or just classics, is the study of ancient Mediterranean cultures and their literatures, language, history, art, and archaeological remains. One branch of classical studies is classical reception studies. Now, classical reception is a term used by scholars to describe any piece of media that receives or reimagines, reproduces, or responds to any aspect of the classical cultures of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. So this is a huge umbrella term. Practically anything could be considered a work of classical reception. So if you want a more in-depth analysis, you can check out my channel intro video. Now, as a direct retelling of the ancient Greek epic poem of the same name, Christopher Nolan's 2026 film, The Odyssey, is an obvious example of classical reception. So by analyzing this film and its reception by the general public, we, as classical reception scholars, you and I, can learn a little bit about the source culture, ancient Greece, and the receiving culture, contemporary America. But most people don't actually engage with classical reception in an academic context, and they probably wouldn't even know to call movies like The Odyssey classical reception. This subfield of classical studies just isn't that well known yet. Instead, most people engage with classical reception through popular discourses on social media sites or online platforms like Twitter. So, Let's now walk through the Nolan Odyssey discourse as it manifested on Twitter in December of 2025. As I already mentioned, this started on December 16th when Discussing Film posted this photo of Penelope and Telemachus. At first, the response to this photo was mostly focused on the costuming, like particularly the creative choice to put Telemachus in pants. More on this later. Now, following the Spine Helmet movie poster release on December 18th, people were starting to raise some serious questions about the art direction of this film because this helmet just frankly doesn't look very Greek, not very ancient. But honestly, the biggest discourse was generated on December 19th after the cam rip of the in-theaters only trailer was posted on Twitter. So people especially fixated on this screenshot showing the front of the black spine helmet. For now, suffice it to say that reactions to this helmet and other images from the film's costumes, especially the armor, were polarizing. Some people loved it. They said it looks cool, it looks comic booky, but like in a good way, you know, like one of Jack Kirby's fantastical designs. And supporters were also quick to say that you're a virgin loser if you don't like these designs. Meanwhile, detractors said the helmet looked ugly, it looked cheap, like 3D printed, but especially that it looked disconnected from ancient Greece. A few days later, people started sharing this AI-enhanced version of the helmet. If you need to use generative AI to make something look cooler, you're not really winning the argument that the original thing looked cool. I'm just saying. Also notable, on December 20th, someone posted a cam rip photo of the Cyclops, which I unfortunately did not screenshot before I got taken down! But Nolan defenders used the presence of this mythical creature, the Cyclops, to make fun of historical accuracy defenders. Now, I obviously have my own thoughts and opinions on all of these talking points, but I'm trying to hold back from sharing them for now. This section is just me trying to summarize the discourse as neutrally as I can manage. So by the time the digital trailer was released on December 22nd, the discourse surrounding this movie was already firmly entrenched. And as I said, the core argument boiled down to, this movie doesn't look very historically accurate. Is that good or bad? Like, does historical accuracy matter? Nolan defenders argued that no, it doesn't matter because it's all fictional and also you're a stupid pretentious virgin for caring about it. The implication of many of these tweets is that historical accuracy is a burden, a limitation rather than an inspiration. Awesomeness in all its subjective glory is the end goal, and it must not be constrained or critiqued in any way. So much for staying neutral. By the way, I tried to highlight tweets that got a lot of engagement and best represented the arguments that I saw showing up on my Twitter feed. This is not an exhaustive list by any measure, and due to the algorithm, I very well may not have been exposed to the full scope of the discourse, but nevertheless, from what I witnessed, historical accuracy defenders argue that Nolan's designs are boring and uninspired. Historical accuracy is actually way cooler, very subjective, but some also argue that historical inaccuracy breaks immersion. Even if the Odyssey is fictional and fantastical, it still has a specific historical context, which is ancient Greece. To which one might reply, well, what is ancient Greece anyway? Like, how are you defining that? And it is a fair question, okay? I think we should be keeping in mind that ancient Greece, as it's conceived of by scholars, actually extends beyond the borders of the modern nation-state of Greece. Here's a map from Wikipedia that's pretty good at showing how, ancient Greek settlements existed all around the Mediterranean Sea. You could call all of this ancient Greece, and we should also remember that the ancient Greeks were not the only people living in the Mediterranean between roughly 3000 BCE and to 500 CE. It's a rough chronology. But despite this large stretch of time and the inherent diversity of the region, this story, the Odyssey, does still have a specific Greek cultural context. Christopher Nolan has said nothing to imply that his version of the story takes place in a different time or a different place or an alternate universe or something like that. He could have done that. That has been done, people have taken the story, the plot, the characters of the Odyssey and set it in space or whatever. But anyone claiming to retell the Odyssey and not Space Odyssey or whatever does need to reckon with the fact that this story comes with a historical cultural context included. And included with that ancient cultural context comes a modern descendant culture. It's wild that I have to say this, but I kind of have to say this. Like, modern Greeks are descended from ancient Greeks, okay? This story is their cultural heritage. So yes, there were some folks of apparent Greek descent expressing frustration with the artistic direction of the film. And while most of the discourse focused on the armor and the costumes, some people also brought up the literal Viking ship being used as a set piece. And some people subliminally brought up race in the casting of the film, like usually through digs at Zendaya, who has been cast as Athena, the goddess of wisdom, warfare, and weaving. Singling out Zendaya, a biracial actress, is definitely a red flag, but compared to how people eventually started talking about Lupita in January, like, this tweet from December is a bit more subtle. They're not saying explicitly what they dislike about Zendaya playing Athena. You know, they're keeping the plausible deniability that maybe, you know, they're critiquing her acting. But, like, come on. This is bullshit. Like, the implication is obvious, right? Like, it's because she's black. It's not about her acting. It's because she's black. So from what little we've seen of the movie so far, is it historically accurate? And does that matter? Like, is it better to embrace inaccuracy, or is it problematic to be inaccurate? Like, which is the wokest stance, okay? Like, what side am I supposed to take on this newest battleground of the culture war? Personally, I think we're asking the wrong questions. Theory time, baby! In the introduction to her 2003 book, Reception Studies, classicist Lorna Hardwick states,
"Reception studies, therefore, are concerned not only with individual texts and their relationship with one another, but also with the broader cultural processes which shape and make up those relationships."
By texts, she means any piece of media. This could be a literal text, like a piece of literature, or it could be a metaphorical text, you know, like an artwork. In this video, we will be discussing two primary texts, the literal piece of ancient literature known as Homer's Odyssey, and Christopher Nolan's upcoming film, which is a metaphorical text. Anyway, what Hardwick is saying in this quote is that classical reception studies is more than just like comparing something old and something new and pointing out all the ways that like the new thing is different from the old thing, okay? Like, classical reception studies is about looking at the bigger picture and considering the cultural contexts that produce the old thing and the new thing, okay? Like, our investigation of these cultural contexts enhances our understanding of the relationship, actually, the relationship between the old thing and the new thing, the old context and the new context. In classical reception studies, we put emphasis on the two-way relationship between source text and culture and receiving text and culture because, as Hardwick says, reception studies does
not only yield insights into the receiving society. Of course, receiving texts do this, but they also focus critical attention back towards the ancient source, and sometimes frame new questions or retrieve aspects of the source which have been marginalized or forgotten.
We can also take some of Hardwick's theoretical principles and turn them into a practical thinking routine to guide our analysis of classical reception. So when analyzing any piece of classical reception, we first ask, how is a particular text received or refigured? Then, what is the context in which this text is received? And finally, what is the purpose, function, or implications of this reception? Like, why is the source text or source culture received in this way? What explicit or implicit message does the receiving text send? What political purpose is served by the receiving text, whether intentionally or unintentionally? What ideologies does it embody or serve? This is where analysis, critique, and debate comes in, okay? The answers to these questions might not be obvious. There might be multiple interpretations. There might not be a verifiably correct interpretation of the receiving text. In classical reception studies, we're not really trying to find one single correct answer to question 3. It's more like, what do you notice about the receiving text? What do you think the implications might be, and what evidence can you marshal to support your argument? And is it convincing to others? So let's now apply this theory-turned-thinking routine to what we know of Christopher Nolan's Odyssey. Okay, let's focus specifically on the armor and the men's costuming because that's what caused the most discourse. So far, we've got Odysseus and Telemachus in some basic armor. There's Telemachus and his casual tunic and pants combo. And then, of course, Agamemnon and his, spine helmet, Backamemnon armor, whatever. These 3 pieces will be our receiving texts. Hold on, I need a costume change in this video. Okay, all right, that's better. Now I've got my own, questionably historically accurate Greek dress on. All right, where were we? Question number 1, how is the source text received or reconfigured? Well, The source text in this instance is ancient Greek armor and clothing writ large. Overall, I do see some similarities to classical Greek armor as it's depicted on ancient vase painting. For instance, the sculpted pecs on Odysseus and Telemachus's breastplates do seem similar to the swirls on Achilles' cuirass on this vase. Note the belted skirt and bare thighs. I wonder if the costume designers also took inspiration from this bronze cuirass, since it features prominently on the Wikipedia pages for cuirass and muscle cuirass. Also, as much as people on Twitter expressed boredom with the horsehair crusted helmet, this is a pretty popular style of helmet in Greek vase painting. Like, often the crest would sit a bit higher than this, but we do find examples like this in ancient art too. By the way, we're mostly looking at depictions of helmets on pottery, since you won't be able to find any like fully intact surviving helmet in any museum in the world because hair decomposes. Like, at most you might find the metal part of the helmet, though this would probably be ceremonial or like a funerary object rather than a practical helmet. Like, helmets that were actually used in combat would probably get damaged and then be melted down so the metal could be reused for something else. As a general rule, any sculpted metal that survives from antiquity was probably only preserved because it was deposited in a funerary context, or because it sank to the bottom of the ocean in a shipwreck. Like, both of these circumstances would have saved a piece of metal from being melted down and reused, so that's why I'm looking at paintings of helmets on Greek pots instead of looking at the helmets themselves. Anyway, so sculpted cuirasses, crested helmets, and greaves. Looks like they are actually wearing greaves, not just boots, so points for that. I suppose we'll have to forgive the actors for wearing shoes instead of being barefoot like proper Greek heroes. Like, you do have to account for many practical concerns when filming a live action movie, which is why I prefer animation. So sculpted cuirasses, crested helmets, and greaves. These all clearly correspond to illustrations of ancient armor on ancient Greek pottery. So we can say that to this extent, the costuming is historically accurate. There are some anachronistic inclusions though, namely the capes, the forearm bracers, the pants, and of course the spine helmet. Greek men are often shown wearing cloaks, but they're usually pinned at one shoulder like this. Honestly, the way Odysseus is wearing his cloak here looks pretty accurate to me, but the way that Agamemnon's cape is pinned to both shoulders definitely makes it look more like a modern superhero cape. And, you know, with these big circular attachments, it actually looks a lot like Disney Hercules' cape. Moving on to forearm bracers. This surprised me because it seems like a pretty obvious no-brainer, right? If you're not wearing full armor, surely you need to wear something that, like, protects your arms, right? Except I can't find a single ancient Greek pot or sculpture that depicts someone wearing arm guards or forearm bracers or anything like that. That's just doesn't seem to be a thing that ancient Greeks wore. And I feel like it's really popular to see people wear these in classical receptions. So I feel like this must be some kind of like medieval Ren Fair fantasy, like projection back into the past or something like that. Because like, I cannot find any basis for including forearm bracers in your ancient Greek armor. You know, like, I almost wonder if... No, there's no way. There's no way it all goes back to Disney Hercules, right? Like, no, okay, I mean, like, well, what are these things anyway? Are they supposed to be arm cuffs? Like, I thought they were supposed to evoke sweatbands, you know? Because, like, while this movie is ostensibly about Hercules becoming a hero, right? It frames the journey like a sports flick, like... Hercules is an aspiring athlete, right? Like, that's why he wears the headband. Like, yes, it's a hair tie, but it's also meant to evoke a 1980s sweatband, you know? Like, surely this image of, like, Hercules in leather forearm bracers must come from all those Italian Hercules films from the 1950s and 60s, right? Like, but in general, why do so many Greek characters have these thick metal bracelets anyway? Like, I have never seen ancient Greek jewelry, either in pottery or sculpture or actual surviving jewelry that looks like this. Usually it's way more delicate, way more intricate. Honestly, who the hell wears thick metal bracelets? Wait. Oh my god. What? Oh my god, hold on. Wonder Woman's bracers have nothing to do with Greek jewelry or armor. I need you to understand this, okay? They were originally inspired by Olive Byrne's bracelets. Do you know Olive Byrne? I don't know if I'm saying her name right, but like, she was the supposed polyamorous third to Wonder Woman creators, William and Elizabeth Marston. Like, you know, so instead of wearing wedding bands, because they couldn't actually get married, she would wear these thick bracelets. And like, William Marston has explicitly stated that he based Wonder Woman's bracelets off of Olive Byrne's bracelets. So like, does this actually all go back to Wonder Woman? Is Matt Damon wearing leather bracers because of polyamory? I mean, I can't prove any of this right now, but wow, huge, if true, right? I'm gonna have to publish on that. I'm gonna keep looking into this, okay? Suffice it to say that the forearm bracers are not historically accurate to ancient depictions of Greek armor. What else we got? Pants, not accurate. Sleeves on the tunic, seems weird. Spine on helmet, never seen that before. Don't get me wrong, helmets could get really fancy and like fantastical in art, but I've never seen bones or spinal cords involved in any way. So like, all in all, we can say that the capes, the bracers, the pants, the spinal helmet are all historically inaccurate. They're not responding to any ancient source text, at least not that I could find. There's also the question of colors. Like, many people objected to the fact that Agamemnon's armor is black instead of bronze colored. Like, if it's bronze, shouldn't it look like bronze, right? But, this is part of why people said that Agamemnon looks like Batman. Interestingly, though, Nolan actually did come out in defense of this creative choice. In the Time magazine interview, he specifically says,
"There are Mycenaean daggers that are blackened bronze. The theory is they probably could have blackened bronze in those days. You take bronze, you add more gold and silver to it, then use sulfur."
These comments baffled folks on Twitter who assumed that Nolan was just making shit up. But actually, he's not. These are the Mycenaean daggers that he's referring to. And to quote archaeologist Brian Cockrell in his 2009 article, "Colorful Corrosion, Black Bronze, and its Enigmatic Patina," these are luxurious, non-functional daggers excavated from Mycenaean sites that often show a combination of black patina and precious metal foil on their surfaces. The black patina appears in panels with precious metal as an inlay. I've seen these daggers in person, and for the longest time, I thought that the black patination, or the surface treatment, that's what that means, I thought it was caused by age and degradation. That's what causes bronze to turn green after all. It's oxidizing from age and exposure. But according to Cockrell, the black patination is actually intentional. This is what Nolan is talking about when he says that they could have had blackened bronze in those days. Now, Nolan is still making quite the leap from small amounts of inlaid black bronze on funerary daggers to full body, battle ready black bronze armor. But even if this armor isn't accurate to the archaeological evidence that we find, we have not found any archaeological remains of black bronze Greek helmets. But nonetheless, the blackened bronze armor from this movie is at least inspired by something that actually does exist in the ancient Greek world. According to another article by conservation scientists Paul Craddock and Alessandra Jumlia-Mer, there are textual references to black patinated copper alloys inlaid with gold and silver from Homer onwards. Specifically, in Iliad Book 18, Hephaestus, the god of blacksmiths and metallurgy, makes the shield of Achilles out of copper, tin, gold, and silver, all melted together and profusely decorated with inlaid scenes. The authors connect this description to later Greek references to Corinthian bronze, which was described as kyanos, or blue-black colored. So you could argue that there is a mythical precedent for Homeric heroes having black patinated bronze armor and weapons. But putting Agamemnon specifically in fully blackened bronze armor is still a bit of an extrapolation. This is something that only Achilles had. Now, not gonna lie, it is kind of funny to me that this concept of blackened bronze is just so niche and unheard of that most people assumed it was completely historically inaccurate. But this is just one example, again, of the two-way relationship between receiving text and source text. Here we have a work of classical reception that focuses critical attention back towards the ancient source and retrieves aspects of the source culture which have been forgotten. Now, you may be wondering, Sierra, except for this random, black and bronze thing, all the examples of Greek armor that you've shown so far look like they're coming from, classical Greek art. But what about Mycenaean armor? Isn't the Odyssey set during the Bronze Age? Shouldn't they be wearing Mycenaean armor? Well, technically, yes. The Iliad and the Odyssey are set in the deep past, okay? These stories concern figures whom historical Greeks saw as their ancestors. And scholars have identified certain clues in the text as referring to technologies and cultural practices of the Bronze Age, during which mainland Greece was dominated by a cultural group we call the Mycenaeans. So yes, one could tell a version of the story which is very firmly set in the Bronze Age with Mycenaean clothing and cultural practices and At this point, we actually have plenty of evidence for what Mycenaean armor might have looked like. Like, there's the famous boar's tusk helmets, which not only do actually survive in pieces, we do have the pieces of the boar's tusk, we can put them back together again, but they also appear in Bronze Age frescoes and carved ivories, and Odysseus himself is described as wearing one of these boar's tusk helmets in Iliad Book 10, lines 260 to 271. Meriones gave to Odysseus a bow, a quiver, and a sword, and placed a leather helmet on his head, stretched tight with many straps inside, and on the outside, numerous white boar's teeth were set upon it, arranged with skill at careful intervals, and on the inside it was lined with felt. I really, really hope there's a moment in the new movie where Odysseus, like, puts on a boar's tusk helmet and then, like, everyone in the audience loses their mind. Like, oh my god, can you imagine if Odysseus has to, like, earn his boar's tusk helmet? Like, it's a freaking Marvel movie. Like, the superhero has to earn their costume in the final act. Oh my god. You know what? Actually, this tweet. I want to live this tweet. Everyone, please, let's all agree to start hooting and hollering in the theater as soon as the C appears on screen. Please. We're in agreement? Yes? We're gonna do it. It's gonna happen. Yeah. Anyway, boar's tusk helmets are not the only kind of Mycenaean armor that we know about. Like, there's also the quite spectacular Dendra panoply, which is one of those rare bronze finds which only survives because it was deposited in a tomb. And then there's also famous pots like the Warrior Crater, which illustrate a totally different kind of Bronze Age armor, which seems to have like horns projecting from the helmets and maybe some kind of woven tunic with tassels. So, you know, needless to say, nothing that we've seen so far from Nolan's Odyssey looks anything like this. And it's not like it would have been impossible to recreate these kinds of Bronze Age armor. Okay, if you were deep in the December discourse, you might have seen tweets with pictures like this floating around. These are both pictures of replica armor made by Dimitrios Katsikis, a contemporary Greek artist who painstakingly researches and recreates historical Greek armor from the Bronze Age all the way to the medieval period. The picture in this tweet is from the Kotsanis Museum of Ancient Greek Technology and Musical Instruments in Athens, which you should definitely go visit if you ever go to Athens. Do not skip this museum. It's really good. Like, y'all, they have replica kithara and lyres that you can actually play. Like, what more do I need to say? Go to the Acropolis Museum, go to the Kotsanis Museum, and if you're a diehard fan and you love museums and you love Greek art, then you should go to the National Archaeological Museum because that thing is huge. It's just so big and tiring. Anywho, what's being referred to in this tweet is a rumor that Dimitrios Katsikis was contacted by Nolan's team and then ghosted. Nolan haters seized on this rumor to further justify their argument that Nolan's film is creatively bankrupt and like artistically mid, since they could have collaborated with a contemporary Greek artist to create costumes which are both visually spectacular, historically accurate, and authentically Greek. But they didn't. I traced this rumor back through Reddit to a now deleted post from Katsikis' Facebook page, and I just asked him about it directly. He confirmed that Nolan's team did contact him, but he didn't disclose the nature of that conversation, and he said he deleted the post because he didn't want to cause problems with the production. So, like, fair enough. Do not go harass this guy. He is very nice and very passionate about his work. He actually recently completed a reconstruction of a boar's tusk helmet based on this carved ivory found in his hometown in Greece. Like, that's so cool. That's such a great connection between past and present. If you're interested in historical ancient Greek armor, I highly encourage you to look into Katsikis' work. I'm going to add some links in the description to his website and his Facebook account where he's currently most active, and then also some YouTube videos made about him. But for the purposes of this video essay, suffice it to say that Nolan and his team were not unaware of, recent research and reconstructions of historical Greek armor. They just chose not to pursue them. Now, I said a minute ago that the Iliad and the Odyssey are set in the deep past, in the Bronze Age, right? But based on certain stylistic quirks of the Greek language used in the poems themselves, we believe that they were actually composed several hundred years later in the 8th century BCE. And from the early Iron Age onwards, we see ancient Greeks throughout the Archaic, Classical, and Hellenistic periods all depict scenes from the Iliad and the Odyssey in armor and clothing that was contemporary with their cultural context. So, there is ancient precedent for depicting a supposedly Bronze Age hero like Odysseus in classical Greek armor, okay? It's not exactly historically inaccurate for Odysseus to be depicted in a helmet with a horsehair plume instead of a boar's tusk helmet. So now we get to the heart of the problem, okay? What ancient text, what specific media, which ancient time period is Nolan receiving? It seems like we're mostly getting Iron Age aesthetics based on, the armor that we've seen so far. But not completely, right? If we look beyond the costumes, we can see that there are some Bronze Age style wall paintings in the palaces. There's the throne in Ithaca. It looks kind of like the throne from Knossos on Crete. I mean, it's like a Minoan site, but like it's still Bronze Age, so I can see why they took inspiration from it. And Odysseus has an inlaid gold sword that it looks a lot like those inlaid gold Mycenaean daggers that I was talking about earlier. So, kudos for that, actually. That's a nice touch. Props to the prop team. So we've got Iron Age and Bronze Age aesthetics, and then some things that, technically aren't Greek at all, right? like the Viking ship. You could argue that this Viking ship looks plausibly ancient enough, and we don't really have much to go off of for Bronze Age ships. I mean, none of them survive, and the best evidence I can think of is this Bronze Age wall painting from the island of Santorini, which you can see in the basement level of the Museum of Prehistoric Thera, another museum you should definitely see if you ever go to Santorini. Do not skip this. Do not go to Akrotiri and then not go to the museum, because all the cool stuff found at Akrotiri is in the museum. There are vase painting depictions of early Iron Age and classical ships, though, and there is one seaworthy reconstructed trireme owned by the Greek Navy. I don't know, my guess is probably there were practical limitations that prevented Nolan's team from filming on this ship, or maybe Nolan sees Greek culture and Viking culture as interchangeable because they're both old. I don't know. At this point, I don't feel like I have enough information to definitively argue one way or the other. Let's just move on to something else. Why? Okay, so this appears to be a scene from Troy, since, the Trojan horse is right there. And honestly, I don't even care about the horse, whatever. What's stumping me is the square columns. I feel like everyone's pretty familiar with, Greek columns at this point. They're pretty, Ionic. But, iconic anyway. They're very consistently cylindrical. I guess maybe Nolan is trying to use square columns to signal that the Trojans are ethnically and culturally different from the Greeks? Except we're pretty confident that the ancient city of Troy corresponds to a site called Hisarlik on the coast of modern-day Turkey, and plenty of these ancient coastal sites in Turkey share many cultural signifiers like architecture with mainland Greece. The coastal areas, at least, are considered part of ancient Greece. Remember that map I showed before? Yeah, okay, again, ancient Greek culture expands beyond the boundaries of the modern nation state of Greece. Ancient Greeks weren't just living in mainland Greece, they were all over the Mediterranean. Hell, those Ionic columns I was just joking about, they're named after the region of Ionia, which is just south of Hisarlik on the coast of Turkey. So, sure, there were cultural differences between Greeks on the mainland and Greeks in Anatolia and the Trojans themselves, but not huge cultural differences. Going from cylindrical to rectangular columns is a pretty huge difference to me. Okay, this is as if you had a movie set in the Palace of Versailles, but instead of having the Hall of Mirrors, you got a bunch of IKEA mirrors instead. Yeah, they're both mirrors, but the difference is significant. One area where you could argue that non-Greek looking material is justified is with these guys. These screenshots are from the second digital trailer, which dropped on May 4th, 2026. And I guess these are the Lystragonians. It's pretty weird to see full plate iron armor in ancient Greece, but if these people are Lystragonians, then they're not exactly Greek. They're part of Greek myth, but in Greek myth, they're a scary foreign group of inhumanly large and powerful man-eating monsters. So I guess you could signal that otherness through unfamiliar, even anachronistic looking armor. Yeah, I'm just gonna leave it at that. Let's move on. Time to review. Okay, question 1 in our classical reception thinking routine asks us to consider, how is the source text received or reconfigured? If we consider ancient Greek aesthetics, especially ancient Greek armor, as our source text, then we can say that it is being received very loosely in this film. Okay, so what we seem to have in Nolan's Odyssey is a pastiche of different time periods, Bronze Age and Iron Age, Mycenaean and Classical Greek, with influence from other prominent works of classical reception like Disney's Hercules. And even when an aspect of the film's costuming does correspond or seem to be like responding in some way to an ancient precedent, like, the idea of Greek heroes wearing cloaks or using black and bronze daggers, it often becomes extrapolated and stylized to the point of inaccuracy. So this is how we end up with Agamemnon's full black armor and his superhero cape. Question 2. What is the context in which the source text is received? Well, the Odyssey, 2026, is a big Hollywood blockbuster. It's directed by a famous, renowned director, Christopher Nolan, and it features a star-studded, thoroughly American cast. None of the major characters are played by Greek actors or actors of Greek descent. No one seems to have a Greek accent. They aren't speaking Greek. No Greek or Linear B writing has been revealed yet. And as we just discussed, the material culture, the armor, the ship, the architecture, it's a bit incoherent. What is Nolan's knowledge of the source text and the source culture? Well, in this interview, published in Empire magazine, Nolan mentions Emily Wilson's translations of the Odyssey, so he has engaged, at least to some degree, with the epic poem itself. Also, no, I will not be engaging in the Emily Wilson translation debate, because this really isn't a debate outside of, reactionary right-wing grifter circles, okay? No serious classicist is clutching their pearls over Wilson's translations. They're perfectly fine for public audiences, okay? Lady of the Library recently put out 2 videos that touch on Wilson's translations and how they differ from previous translations. Go watch those instead. As you can see, I have 3 translations of the Odyssey and an edited volume of the Greek text itself by M.L. West, okay? What do you know about that, huh? Don't talk to me about Greek translations if you don't know the GOAT M.L. West. Anyway, Nolan also mentions the films of Ray Harryhausen, so he's also engaging with famous modern works of classical reception. Even though Harryhausen never actually made an Odyssey movie, his Jason and the Argonauts from 1963 and Clash of the Titans from 1981 are extremely iconic, not just in terms of classical reception, but in filmmaking as a whole. Nolan generally speaks about the Odyssey as a universal story, as part of the world's heritage, something we all share.
I remember seeing a school play of Ulysses when I was 5 or 6 years old. The older kids were doing it. I remember the sirens and him being strapped to the mast and things like that. But that's barely a conscious memory. I think it's in all of us, really. And when you start to break down the text and adapt it, you find that all these other films, and all the films I've worked on, they're all from the Odyssey. Emma said it best when we first announced the project. It's foundational.
Many people will relate to this sentiment, okay? I know from personal experience that many Americans are exposed to Greek myths at a very young age in schools as fairy tales or universal folklore. And this is reflected in the way that Nolan speaks about the Odyssey, okay? In universalizing the story, it becomes disconnected from the specific cultural context which produced it. All right, now we get into the juicy parts. Question 3, what is the purpose, function, or implications of this reception? Well, Nolan's explicitly stated goals all revolve around cinematic culture and technology. In the Empire interview, Nolan says,
as a filmmaker, you're looking for gaps in cinematic culture, things that haven't been done before. And what I saw is that of all the great mythological cinematic work that I had grown up with, Ray Harryhausen movies and other things, I never seen that done with the sort of weight and credibility that an A-budget and a big Hollywood IMAX production could do.
This interview especially highlights the IMAX technology that Nolan and his team invented to make this movie. So again, the focus is on cinematic technology. Nolan isn't saying, I want to reinvent Odysseus, or I want to tell a version of the Odyssey set in a new context. No, it's, I want to tell an expensive IMAX version of the Odyssey that has weight and credibility. As a Hollywood blockbuster, the purpose of this film is not to educate, but to entertain. It's not a textbook or a documentary, so I can see why folks would ask why this movie is being held to the standard of historical accuracy, when, with other works of classical reception, we often don't interact with them expecting an accurate or an authentic depiction of the ancient world. And between the like square columns and like Backememnon over here, I can see why some folks argue that Nolan is also aiming for a hyper-stylized, intentionally inaccurate adaptation of ancient Greek aesthetics and material culture. But at the same time, I also don't blame people for thinking that Nolan was going to give us something more grounded and realistic, given some of the other messaging around this film. Nolan says he wants his film to have weight and credibility. The trailer is serious and down to earth. The music is somber. The sky is gray. Everyone's dressed in black or like really, really dark brown. And, you know, people seem gaunt and dirty and grungy. And all of these details are part of a wider cinematic context, like somber music, flat gray colors, dark, gritty vibes. These are all ways that films about other fantastical things, like superheroes, signal to their audience that they're taking a grounded, realistic approach to their story matter. And Nolan himself is the blueprint, okay? Like, he started the grim, dark, realistic superhero film genre with the freaking Dark Knight trilogy. So, like, of course, people were going to expect his Odyssey film to feel true to life in some ways. You know, doesn't realism include being accurate to a film's historical setting? But okay, like, benefit of the doubt, has Nolan actually said that his Odyssey will be realistic or accurate to ancient Greece? Well, this tweet from Nolan Analyst would certainly lead you to think so. After all, it strongly emphasizes the realistic approach that Nolan is taking, which others came back to challenge once more inaccurate costumes and set photos were released. Now, I believe we are witnessing both the limitations of the English language and the limitations of Twitter specifically for having nuanced, productive media analysis and discourse. Because when these two tweets use the words realism and realistic, they're talking about historical accuracy, which is an important part of making media feel realistic to a specific historically inspired setting like ancient Greece. But if we look at what's written about this film in a piece of actual journalism, not just a tweet from a Nolan Stan account, the emphasis is all on what the interviewer calls tactile realism, no CGI, filming on location, on real boats, in real water, with real beards. That's tactile realism. Now, I can't find any interviews where Nolan actually claims this term or uses the phrase itself, but tactile realism does seem like a useful way of describing Nolan's investment in preserving and advancing filmmaking techniques that give a sense of the real world. Like, especially at a time when there is such an oversaturation of bad CGI that movies are starting to feel kind of inauthentic. But tactile realism in Nolan's Odyssey doesn't seem to have anything to do with historical accuracy. It's more like some abstract sense that the story feels real to you, like you, the audience member, are really out there on the waves. You know, it really makes you feel like Spider-Man. I mean, like Odysseus. But in a way that's disconnected from any of the cultural signifiers that would locate the story in a coherent ancient Greek context. So back to question 3, what is the purpose of this classical reception? Well, maybe it's to tell an ancient epic story with modern film technology that is grounded in a sense of tactile realism, not historical realism. In Nolan's own words from the Time magazine interview,
"The wonderful thing about cinema, and IMAX in particular, is that you can take an audience to a place of immersion, feeling close to the events like storms, turbulent seas, high winds. You want the audience to be on the boat with them, fearing the ocean, fearing the wrath of Poseidon, the way the characters do."
Sounds great. However, this emphasis on tactile realism does not spare Nolan's Odyssey from any and all critique. After all, tactile reality is not defined purely by filming on location or by real beards. Seriously, why such an emphasis on real beards? Why does Matt Damon need to grow a real beard, but it's not important for Agamemnon's armor to look like something that is immediately recognizable to the audience as an actual ancient material? Clearly, the black patinated bronze thing was not legible to most audiences. No one knew what this was. And ironically, the AI-enhanced image seemed more realistic since the scuffs and scrapes make the helmet look more obviously like bronze. Materiality does matter for immersion. I get that, which is why it's odd to me to only emphasize certain materials like hair as essential for tactile realism. Honestly, if anything, I think this whole debate just illustrates how subjective reality is. If your mental understanding of ancient Greece doesn't account for black patinated bronze because you've never heard of these Mycenaean funerary daggers, then a full body suit of black bronze armor is going to feel unrealistic. And even if you are aware of these funerary daggers, again, it is still quite the jump to go from small amounts of inlaid black bronze to full body armor. So even if you know that this costume is historically inspired, it still might not feel like a realistic creative choice. And isn't the point of tactile realism that feeling of immersion? That's going to be hard to achieve with every audience member since we all have different personal understandings of historical reality. There's still the matter of decontextualization to discuss. Okay, ultimately, the function or like the effect of these historically mishmashed costumes and set pieces is that the film appears to be presenting a version of the Odyssey that is disconnected from the historical culture it originates from. Sure, maybe you feel like you're on the water with Odysseus, but do you feel like you're in the Mediterranean? Is the water Mediterranean? Is this the wine dark sea? Nothing about these set photos and trailers felt Greek to many folks. Honestly, though, this is true of like many, if not most, works of classical reception. It is extremely common for an adaptation of an ancient Greek myth to have very little interest in depicting actual Greek culture, past or present. And you know what? This makes me want to address the Cyclops situation real quick. Okay, some folks use the presence of the Cyclops, a mythical one-eyed giant, to argue against the need for historical accuracy. So the implication of these tweets is that the presence of any supernatural, mythical, or fantastical elements in the story means that the story no longer needs to abide by any measure of historical accuracy. Now, I want to clarify something here. The complaints of historical inaccuracy being leveled at Christopher Nolan's Odyssey are not about anachronistic technology or like impractical physics or whatever. The complaint about the Viking ship is not about how the Viking ship is like newer and thus more technologically advanced and how it shouldn't be used instead of an older ship. No, the complaint is that a Viking ship isn't Greek. The complaints about historical inaccuracy in Nolan's Odyssey are about inaccurate depictions of Greek culture. The presence of the Cyclops doesn't diminish the need to accurately depict Greek culture because even though this is a mythical, fantastical monster, it is a fundamentally Greek mythical, fantastical monster, okay? Cyclops, Kyklops, it's a Greek word, okay? The Cyclops is not some stock Hollywood movie monster, okay? It is a product of Greek culture and mythology. Maybe other cultures also invented one-eyed monsters, and maybe those monsters have come to be called Cyclopses in English, but this Cyclops is Greek. It doesn't matter if Greek monsters are not real. The debate is not just about accurate depictions of Greek history, it's also about authentic representations of Greek culture, which includes mythical monsters. So when discussing classical reception, our source texts include both historical, archaeological material evidence and the mythical, fantastical narratives invented by these cultures. This Cyclops conversation touches on a wider point that Greek mythology is not fantasy. It may be fantastical, but it is not fantasy. It is not genre literature. It is fundamentally connected to a specific historical cultural context. So at most, you could say it's similar to historical fiction. But really, we should not only be thinking about Greek mythology from the perspective of literary criticism, okay? We need to be putting on our anthropology hats, okay? Lady of the Library has a good video about this topic as well. She essentially outlines the differences between fantasy and mythology, and she uses the Lord of the Rings to do so. If I may borrow her metaphor, Lord of the Rings is a piece of literature within the fantasy genre. It is inspired by a specific culture and time period, medieval Europe, but it is not a product of that culture and time period, okay? It was written by a British dude in the 20th century. The same is not true of the Odyssey. The Odyssey, like in Greek mythology more broadly, is not inspired by ancient Greece. It is ancient Greece, okay? It is a piece of Greek folklore and cultural heritage. I realize I'm getting kind of like heated about this, so let's like walk it back a little. Although I think the distinction between mythology and fantasy is important to recognize, I am not saying that people cannot create works of classical reception that are intentionally fantasy-y. There are many works of classical reception that I adore, which signal to their audience, often through intentionally stylized depictions of Greek cultural signifiers, that the reception is not intended to be historically accurate, okay? Historically inaccurate media can still include great storytelling. It can be mostly inaccurate, but still have some clever allusions to ancient Greek culture, or maybe some inversions on ancient Greek culture. Personally, I think framing is what matters here, okay? Does the classical reception frame itself as presenting an accurate depiction of ancient Greece? Or does it signal or communicate through its designs, dialogue, music, story, or like creators' direct comments that the reception is not trying to be historically accurate? In the former situation, when a receiving text is claiming and failing to be accurate to its source text or culture, that's when conversations about historical accuracy can be very important, because it is useful to help the general public understand what is historical reality and what is not. And personally, I think it's fair to be critical of media whose inaccuracies seem based on laziness or general disrespect for the source text or the source culture. But in the case of media that is not making any claims to historical accuracy, I understand why people get annoyed with folks who harp on and on about the inaccuracies, as if those inaccuracies automatically make the classical reception bad. Sometimes folks do not enter these conversations in good faith, and their critiques aren't actually engaging with the receiving text and what it's trying to do. Like, you will never see me going on a rant about like Disney's Hercules or whatever and all of its historical inaccuracies, because the movie signals to the audience right from the start through its gospel music that it's not trying to represent ancient Greece accurately, because this musical genre didn't exist yet. But at the same time, the inclusion of real Greek sculptures in the opening sequence tells me that the creators of this film have done some research and they do have respect for the source culture. Like, did you know that, by the way? Did you know that all of these sculptures correspond to real ancient Greek and Roman sculptures? It's really cool, actually. I mean, except for this one. This is some random sculpture from the 19th century. I don't know why this is here. But overall, this sequence tells me that the creators of the film are attempting to accurately represent some aspects of ancient Greek culture, like bronze and marble sculpture. I understand that they are making intentional creative deviations from their source text, and I'm thus better able to enjoy whenever the film does make clever jokes and references to the source culture. Personally, I believe that historical inaccuracies do not necessarily make a work of classical reception bad or problematic, okay? But the mere inclusion of fantastical elements in a work of classical reception does not mean that that reception is suddenly free from any and all critique about its historical inaccuracies. In general, in classical reception studies, discussion of historical accuracy has its place as part of question 1. How is the source text received or reconfigured? But we should be thinking beyond historical accuracy and also considering question 2, right? What is the context in which the source text is received? And especially considering question 3. What is the purpose, function, or implications of the reception? What ideologies does it embody or serve? In the case of Nolan's Odyssey, I think Christopher Nolan is trying to have his cake and eat it too. The creative choices being advertised in these posters and trailers and set photos do suggest that some of the costumes are stylized to the point of inaccuracy. If I was feeling generous, I'd say that what we've seen of the film so far presents a mishmash of like historically inspired costumes and buildings, but the film is not located in a coherent, historically and culturally accurate time period, which could be fine. Like, as I said earlier, the Homeric epics are a mishmash of Bronze Age and Iron Age technologies and cultural practices. Like, it would be understandable for a modern film to also be influenced by contemporary aesthetics like Wonder Woman's bracelets and Disney Hercules' superhero cape, and yet the marketing campaign for this movie has yet to outright acknowledge that it is both historically inspired and ahistorical. Instead, Nolan and his interviewers are all emphasizing realism and veracity, and saying he's like an old cuddly professor. And they're not addressing any of the creative choices that seem completely ahistorical and culturally decontextualized, because the emphasis on realism and veracity gives the film a sense of prestige and authority. And they don't want to give that up. So I guess now I should be fully honest with you about what I think about Nolan's Odyssey. Okay, are Nolan bros right to defend whatever historical inaccuracies appear in this film as intentional creative choices that serve a grander artistic vision? Or is Nolan a creatively bankrupt hack and this movie is going to be an insult to Greek culture? What is my answer to question 3? What do I think the implications and ideologies of this classical reception will be? I don't know yet. The movie is not out yet. I haven't seen it. I don't know. I can give my thoughts on some of the creative decisions we've seen so far, but I'm not ready to make any claims about the entire film. I can say that fundamentally, I'm not interested in standing any particular creative. Like, I have no deep love for Christopher Nolan and his work, and even if I did, that wouldn't make him or his films, like, above critique. If anything, I'm probably more critical of my faves just because I spend more time thinking about them and their work. I can also say that I don't like how Nolan and his team chose not to collaborate with a contemporary Greek artist. Like, I don't think we can say with 100% certainty that Nolan's team ghosted Dimitrios Katsikis, because we don't actually know the nature of that communication, and I don't think we should be prying. But, you know, like, even if Nolan's team wasn't necessarily outright disrespectful, even if they were totally professional, I still think it's a shame that such a big, affluent production chose not to collaborate and promote the work of a contemporary Greek artist. Generally speaking, though, like, I'm okay with heavily stylized representations of ancient Greece and classical reception if I feel like the creative deviations from the ancient source material are interesting and thought-provoking, and if they reveal a deep love and appreciation for the source text and source culture. Like, there are plenty of inaccuracies in the Hades video game, but there are also elements of the designs and storytelling that tell me that the creatives put a lot of thought and research into what they were making. Like, the music. You can go watch this other video essay I made all about music in Hades if you're interested in learning more about this. Please watch it. It kind of flopped. But anyway, I still acknowledge in that video that there are very valid critiques of Hades and the aspects of Greek culture that it leaves out. Regarding Nolan's Odyssey and the armor specifically, I feel like I'm mostly aligned with these tweets. I don't think the Agamemnon armor is cool as hell, but I do think being intentionally historically inaccurate in favor of something fantastical and historically inspired can be cool. Like, this fan art by Seo appeals to me because I like how it references a gold death mask found at Mycenae, which is famously known as the Mask of Agamemnon. And the choice to make the cloak purple instead of black shows me that the artist knows about the ancient production of purple dye from murex sea snails and how this pigment was super expensive and thus conveyed high status in the ancient world. And I like that it's colorful. Even if it's not historically accurate, I would appreciate something like this more than Costume Castle Odysseus, because I agree. I think Odysseus and Telemachus' armor is an uninspired shorthand for ancient Greece that conforms to modern conceptions of hardened, gritty masculinity. Boring! Boo! I think it's telling that in the attempt to convey Agamemnon's elevated status, they went with black bronze and a black cape, instead of golden bronze and a purple cloak. To answer question 3, I think the implication of this costume design in particular is that Nolan is still fundamentally attached to grim, dark aesthetics, which carry with them certain ideological implications about masculinity being inextricably tied to, like, darkness and misery. To be fully honest, I'm not even interested in live-action adaptations of Greek myths. Like, I feel like animation would be better suited to representing what I imagine when I think of Greek mythology. But there is one thing that I am willing to take a stand on right here, right now. A hill I am willing to die on, something I will critique without having seen the full finished movie, and that's the fucking pants! There is no historical reason to put an ancient Greek man in a pair of pants. There's not even a practical reason to put all these men in pants anyway. Like, I promise you that ancient Greek men were doing all the things that Odysseus and his crew do, you know, fighting, sailing, wandering through the wilderness, in dresses. or skirts or whatever. I mean, you could call them tunics or robes, but there's no pants. So functionally, it's a dress. I mean, surely wearing a dress is a better alternative to the other historically inspired costume choice, which would be heroic nudity, right? Like, I'm sure you've noticed how ancient Greek men are often shown in ancient art either completely or partially nude. And, you know, except for scenes of athletic competitions, which did absolutely occur in the nude, but all these other scenes where the heroes are like naked except for their helmets or like some drapery, it's all symbolic. It's not meant to be taken literally. It's generally accepted by scholars that the heroic nudity evokes the strength and beauty of the hero. Nudity is the costume that heroes wear. It's how we identify them as heroes. Obviously, there are practical reasons why you would not have your actors be constantly naked. I mean, not only is it dangerous and uncomfortable for the actors, but also nudity is way more stigmatized in contemporary cultures than it was at ancient Greece. And there are plenty of ancient artworks that depict Greek heroes fully dressed, okay? It's not like they're only ever naked. So it's not historically inaccurate to put them in clothing. But when they are dressed, they're still in dresses. Seeing Odysseus, Telemachus, and all these other supposedly Greek men wear pants under their armor is honestly laughable, because pants are like the number one way to communicate that someone is not Greek in ancient art. Pants are the cultural marker of non-Greekness in ancient Greek iconography. Only foreigners, like this Trojan archer, wear pants. I know it looks a little bit like he's wearing a jumpsuit, but do you see that line at his thigh? Okay, that's the hem of his tunic. And then do you see the cuff at his ankle? Those are his pants. It's much easier to see on this color reconstruction. But coincidentally, here's a sculpture of Heracles, the quintessential Greek hero, from the same exact temple, the Temple of Athea on Aegina. And what is he wearing? No pants. Look at those thighs. Look at the beautifully sculpted pleats on the dress that Heracles is wearing under his armor. Just amazing. Chef's kiss. There is no artistic or practical reasons for ancient Greek men to wear pants. You will never be able to justify this to me. And hey, remember how I said I also critique my faves? Okay, the Hades game is also guilty of this pants bullshit, okay? Take off those pants, Zagreus. Show me those thighs, Thanatos. Hermes and Dionysus are the only bitches I respect. Honestly, I agree with all those tweets suggesting that Nolan actually wants to tell some kind of like medieval, Viking, Celtic, Northern European version of the Odyssey. Because the visual language he's using, the costumes, the colors, the aesthetics, the tone, it all falls in line with contemporary cinematic conventions for fantasy stories set in or inspired by Northern Europe, like Game of Thrones or whatever. Okay, so let's circle back to our theory turn thinking routine one more time. Okay, after comparing the receiving text with its source text, question 1, and considering both the ancient source context and the modern receiving context, question 2, I am ready to address question 3 and present my theory on the ideological implications of this particular costuming choice in this particular work of classical reception. I think that these pants are the result of cowardice. I 100% agree with this tweet. I think these pants are the result of contemporary fragile masculinity. The choice to ignore ancient evidence for a historical clothing tradition reveals an anxiety, a fear of that historical clothing tradition. Like, Nolan and his team are scared of men wearing dresses and skirts. Their belief that men should and must wear pants is so strong that it overpowers any logic demonstrating that pants are both inaccurate and unnecessary. And this creative decision driven by fear is harmful. It reinforces the incorrect assertion that men always have and always will only wear pants. And this false belief stigmatizes the act of wearing dresses such that now it is impossible for a man, a modern man, to wear a dress without undermining his own masculinity. And don't forget that a threat to masculinity anywhere is a threat to masculinity everywhere. When queer men, even when straight men, when any man wears a dress, This is seen as an attack on other men's masculinity because the very act of dressing contrary to your assigned gender undermines the very idea of a gender binary. And as I'm sure you all know, or as I'm sure you should know, transgressing the gender binary makes you a target for violence. Not to mention that this policing of the gender binary causes psychological harm to all men by limiting their freedom of self-expression. So not only do I think that putting ancient Greek men in pants is cowardly and stupid and inaccurate and boring, I also think it's actively making the world a worse place. Concluding thoughts. Do you see how in both of these conversations about, black patinated bronze armor or pants in classical reception, in both of these, the question of historical accuracy is not so cut and dry. Like, in the case of the armor, something that at first seems completely inaccurate could still have an ancient inspiration that most people just don't know about. In the case of the pants, the problem isn't really just pants are historically inaccurate full stop. It's pants are historically inaccurate on Greek men specifically. And on the surface, whether or not someone's wearing pants or whether their armor is black or bronze colored, it seems really silly, right? Why are we even talking about this? What does it matter? Well, it matters because there are underlying political and social messages being conveyed to the audience through both of these creative choices. And it's important to tease out what those messages are and address them. Yes, it really is that deep, okay? Choosing to dress ancient Greek men in black and in pants it's a choice, okay? It's not natural or inevitable. These costumes are a creative choice motivated by not historical accuracy or authenticity, but by modern contemporary understandings of gender. More specifically, they're motivated by what I believe are fragile and toxic contemporary understandings of masculinity. By working our way through questions 1, 2, and 3, we've now taken our discussion of Nolan's Odyssey beyond the shallow discourses of historical accuracy and started to address the underlying ideological implications of the costuming in this very prominent, very visible work of classical reception. I know that to some of you, this theory turned thinking routine may have seemed very basic, even obvious, but for some folks in the audience, this could all be brand new. I hope that by laying it all out like this, we can all be a little bit more structured, a little bit more mindful in how we engage with any work of classical reception. As a final note, something that I found particularly interesting about the discourse that emerged on Twitter in response to the promotional material for Christopher Nolan's Odyssey was that it developed this narrative that historical accuracy is woke because it's more truthful and more respectful to Greek culture, and historical inaccuracy is problematic because it reflects modern biases that often go unspoken or uninterrogated. But in reality, historical accuracy is neither woke nor problematic. Historical accuracy is a rhetorical tool that can be wielded by anyone to make critiques that advance any political ideology. Thus, it is an insufficient framework for having productive conversations about classical reception. This is something that I will explore in more depth in my part 2 video, which again is going to cover the racist backlash against the casting of Lupita Nyong'o as Helen of Troy. Because in that discourse, historical accuracy was used as a rhetorical tool, as a weapon to exclude Black folks and other ethnic and gender minorities from engaging in any way with classical reception. But for now, I hope this has been a helpful introduction to classical reception studies and a fun overview of some stupid Twitter discourse. So thanks for sticking it out with me to the end of the video. I'll see you in the next one.